I'm really delighted to be talking to you today about mobility, facts, perceptions, and policy. And the way I want to organize this talk is to first start by telling you some new facts based on new data on the persistence of spatial inequality in the US. Then I want to turn to the really important issue of perceptions of mobility across a range of settings, perceptions that are not always in line with reality. And then I want to talk to you about the link between these mobility perceptions and policy views, because what we believe about mobility is actually very important for what we want to do on policies. And then finally, I want to tell you about how your own mobility experiences shape something very important, which is the extent to which you think the world is zero-sum, which will turn out to be a really important predictor of your policy views as well. So let me dive straight into these into the persistence of spatial inequality based on some new data here. A little bit of background on this data. So the data is actually based on this very interesting historical phenomenon in the US, which was the US general property tax. This was a tax that was really special at the turn of the 19th century in the US, which was essentially a comprehensive tax on all property. So not just on real estate. It was essentially a wealth tax. And for over a century, the US relied very heavily on what was a local taxation of wealth. Now, what is interesting for us here, although this is a fascinating public econ topic per se, is that because of this tax administration, we have a very detailed paper trail left about wealth, property at the really granular level. So we use this data that we collect from a variety of sources to construct wealth measures for the US, for all US states, counties, and then also for cities for a more recent period. Overall, we can spend a really long time, and it's really exciting because we have some existing national wealth estimates, but this is actually much higher frequency, comes all from a coherent source, and is a really long run data. And in addition, it was really rare until now to have some consistent and coherent subnational measures. So to look at within the US, for instance, wealth measures. And so what can we learn from this data? Well, on spatial inequality, there's some really interesting facts. So if we start in 1850 and look at the county wealth or county property per capita, to avoid issues with prices and deflators, I'm just normalizing it by the US level GDP per capita. So think of it as how much of a yearly income in the US does that county hold in wealth? And we can see across the decades a really strong persistence. So the Civil War itself will reshuffle things. So you will see from 1860 to 1870 a real reshuffling of the wealth distribution. But after that, it is incredibly persistent. So even though we keep adding some counties, you can sort of see the same places are rich, the same places are poor. And in fact, you can look at this more formally by looking at the rank-rank correlation between starting wealth. So let's take the post-Civil War, so the rank of a county in 1870, and then the rank of the county in subsequent decades, for instance, 1880, 1890, all the way to 1930. The persistence is quite striking. It is a very, very strong persistence. And you can even roll this over until today. So if we compare this to the Opportunity Atlas data by Raj, Nathan, and others, this is our map of per capita wealth in 1920, sorry. And this is the Opportunity Atlas income per capita or income per household data today. So obviously, I've harmonized the colors, but you can see a very strong pattern here. And if you plot a bin scatter of the per capita property in 1920 on the horizontal axis, the rank of a county in terms of per capita property, and the rank of a county today in income, it is a very strong relation. Places like Baton Rouge, Louisiana are wealth poor in 1920, income poor today, and then places like Larimore, Colorado, rich back then and rich today. So very strong persistence, and there's lots of additional things you can look at, for instance, what correlates with wealth in a given place. A final fact I want to show you based on these historical data is a bit the consequences of lack of opportunity or lack of mobility. So we can look at what happens when counties were more unequal on their subsequent growth in wealth. So on this graph, you can see sort of bin scatter. On the horizontal axis, we have the top 10% wealth share in a county. So that's a measure of strong inequality. And you can see many counties are very unequal. And then on the vertical axis, we have the 60-year subsequent growth in per capita property in that county. So the points are residualized on wealth per capita in 1970. That's why some will be slightly above 1. They're recentered, rescaled. But even if you start adding covariates like geographic controls, demographic controls, etc., there's a very strong negative relationship. Counties that were more unequal to start with experienced lower growth subsequently. And a final sort of measure of extreme lack of opportunity and extreme inequality is, of course, counties that were relying more on enslaved people. So an extreme form of, coercion and lack of opportunity for some groups. If you correlate the share of enslaved people, so this is obviously centering only on southern counties. If you correlate the share of enslaved property to subsequent 60-year growth, there is again a very strong and significant negative relationship that is robust to including all these various controls. So this is on the brief historical facts here. And let me switch to the very important issue of how people perceive mobility across a range of settings. So I'll talk about 3 projects here. And all of them have this method in common. So let me just give you a brief sort of pitch for the type of method that we're using here, which is socioeconomic surveys and experiments. So surveys, as we talked about in many of the papers in the morning as well, are something that have been used for a long time to generate statistics. And there's some variables which, today we can better measure in administrative data. Larry was making this point very clearly. Things we couldn't see before with surveys, we can now see in a really high quality way. Yet there's some things that still remain invisible in data, no matter how good it is. And those are things like perceptions, attitudes, knowledge, and views. These are things which we can't see even in the best sort of admin data out there. And so surveys are really more than a tool. They're sort of approach to research. I like to say you can create your own identifying variation and sort of uncover those invisible factors with this approach. And so, of course, for the results to be reliable, it's very important that the surveys are well designed, deployed on appropriate samples, and carefully done. So let me show you some key results from some of the papers related to mobility. So the first project is really about overall perceptions of intergenerational mobility in several countries. So what we try to do is to try to understand if people have accurate perceptions about mobility. And that's obviously a difficult notion. So we have to be careful how we ask people. So what we do is to illustrate the notion of mobility for people with this ladder design. So we tell them, imagine 500 families that represent, say, the US population for US respondents or the German population for German respondents. And imagine that these families are ranked from the 100 poorest all the way to the 100 richest. And imagine now that we take 100 kids from the poorest 100 families. Where do you think those kids will end up once they grow up? Will they be in the 100 poorest, middle 100, etc.? And based on this, we have an intuitive way, a visual way to help people understand what we really mean by mobility. And so what do we see across countries? So here are some findings. So let's start with this probability of staying stuck in the bottom. So staying stuck in poverty. Each dot here is one country. And the horizontal axis tells us the actual probability of a child from the bottom staying in the bottom. And you can see that actually the US is the lowest mobility country on average along this metric. The European countries are more mobile. They have a lower probability of staying stuck in poverty. The vertical axis tells us the average perception of respondents from those countries. And I've labeled the upper region pessimistic because here's where you overestimate the chance of staying stuck in poverty. And optimistic would be, you underestimate that chance, you think there's more mobility. So the US is roughly accurate here, actually, on average. And the European countries are too pessimistic in terms of staying stuck in poverty here. We can look at another notion of mobility, which is this American dream idea, the probability of moving from the very bottom to the very top. So this is here on this graph. So same way to read it. We have the actual probability on the horizontal axis, the average perception per country on the vertical axis. So European countries are again somewhat too pessimistic, although not as strongly as this idea of staying stuck in poverty. But the US is really over optimistic. the respondents in the US tend to overestimate the probability of a child making it from rags to riches in a way that's not borne out by the data. And in fact, because the US is so interesting here, we can actually zoom in across states how these perceptions differ. So on the left, we have the actual mobility, probability of moving from bottom to top. This is taken from Raj and Nathan's data here. So for instance, if there's darker colors, it means there will be more kids moving from the bottom to the top. And then on the right, we have the average perceptions. So you can already see that everywhere the map is sort of darker, right? People are over optimistic in general in the US. But if you look at it more carefully, you can almost see an inverse relation between where mobility is actually lowest, like in the Southeast, and where perceptions are over optimistic. And if you take the ratio, which is the perceived over the actual mobility of moving from the bottom to the top, you can see that in places like the Southeast, people overinflate by a factor of 2 the mobility. And in other places like the Midwest or the mountain states, people are much more accurate and much more realistic about the mobility. Another issue that it's impossible to talk about mobility without talking about it in the US is mobility and race. And this is based on a project that is joined with Alberto and Matteo Ferroni, a student at BU, where we try to understand how people view racial gaps, how they understand them, what they think the causes are. So we try to survey non-Hispanic Black and white respondents across the US. And we survey not only adults here, we also survey teenagers aged 13 to 17 to try and see how really young people think about these issues. So we really oversample Black respondents here to have roughly half the sample. And we ask respondents in detail about their perceptions of economic conditions and opportunities of both Black and white Americans, their attitudes on racial issues, and importantly, their views on what causes racial inequities. And then we also ask them about their degree of support for 2 types of redistribution policy. One is general redistribution, so income targeted, and the other is race targeted, so explicitly conditioning on race. So here are some of the perceptions for mobility across different racial groups. So let's focus on the left column here, which is from the adult survey. The right one will be from the teenager or youth survey. So if we look at the top left panel here, we can see the perceived probability of moving from the bottom quintile to at least Q3. So, middle class and more. And we see the perception separately. What's the probability of white children moving up and what's the probability of Black children moving up in different rows? I show you here the average perception for white respondents in the sample and Black respondents in the sample. And then the reality is the green diamond. So in the bottom, we see the same, but it's now split by political affiliation. So we zoom in within white respondents between white Democratic respondents and white Republican respondents. What are some key results here? Well, there's two key findings. If we look at the mobility of white children that people think happens, in general, we can see that there is this slight over-optimism, right, that we saw in the previous study. Remember, the previous study was very much about moving from the very bottom to the very top, so the numbers will be different. And in fact, it is especially Black respondents that tend to overestimate the mobility of white children by quite a lot. And there's also a bit of a partisan gap where Republican respondents are more over-optimistic about mobility. What about the mobility of Black children? Here, the story is very clear. It is much, much lower than people think. So everyone really vastly overestimates the mobility of Black children. There is a much stronger partisan gap here. Republican respondents are much more likely to overestimate it. And if anything, Black respondents are also overestimating it by a bit more than white respondents. What about children or like teenagers? What about their perception? So here we can't ask them detailed quantitative questions. So we simplify it to qualitative questions. For instance, do you think that the chances that a white child moves, becomes rich are close to 0, low, fairly high, high? So it's qualitative questions. So we can't compare really across the 2 panels, and we can also not really compare to reality. The numbers don't mean that much in levels. It's just interesting to compare across groups. So what we can see is that, even among children, there's that strong over-optimism of Black children about what the chances of white children are. And, white children are generally much more pessimistic about their own chances. And then if we look at the bottom right panel, we split children or we split teenagers based on their political affiliation of their parents. Do they live in a Republican household or in a Democratic household? And we can see partisan gaps in the perceptions here too, where teenagers who live in Republican households will be more optimistic, especially about the mobility of Black children, than those in Democratic households. The third perception I want to talk to you about is how we position ourselves relative to others, where we think we rank relative to others. And this is based on a joint project with Christopher Quidberg and Klaus Kreiner. What do we do in this project? Well, there's a very important perception, which is how we rank ourselves relative to others. And of course, issues of mobility are intrinsically linked to where we rank or we think we rank relative to others. And so people may care about their social position, let's say their income position, among others, in various reference groups. So what are possible reference groups? Well, I may care about others of the same age as me. That would be my cohort. I may care about those in the same city as me, or those in the same sector or firm, those in the same neighborhood, etc. So those could be my reference groups. And each of these reference groups may matter differently to me. So what we try to understand here is how well do people know their position in these various reference groups? And then how does this shape their views on inequality, on fairness, and then ultimately on policy? So to do this, you actually need a lot of data. You actually need data on people's perceptions. So this is why we design a survey where we try to ask people about their perceptions of the income distributions of their various reference groups and where they think they rank in them. But you also need data on reality. So for this, we match respondents to their registered data, which is a really high quality data in Denmark that has people's incomes, but also their whole income histories and life events such as unemployment or health shocks. And then all of that for their reference groups too. So for instance, we know who your neighbors are and we can see what has been the income history of your neighbors. So we know the perception side here and the reality side at a very granular level. And in addition, we can see what happens to you based on your position or based on changes on your position due to life cycle changes or life events, how that shapes your perceptions and your fairness views. So let me tell you in a bit more detail how we do it, again, to build some confidence in the methods. So first important thing we need to do is to make sure that that we elicit people's perceptions of the income distribution. We don't want you to just rank yourself. We want to know, do you have an accurate income distribution in mind for each reference group? So for each reference group, we will ask people, tell us what the median income of that group is, and give us a sense of the top income, so the top 5th percentile. So first we'll show people an instructional video that explains the notion of percentiles, of the median, of the top income, so that they know what we're asking about, and we're going to give them names. For instance, the median will be P50, and then the top 5th percentile will be P95. And then we'll dig into asking people about each of the reference groups that they're part of. So this will be adapted to each respondent. For instance, this person here is born in 1970. So we'll start by asking them, what do you think is the P50, the median income for people born in 1970? So they put in some number. And then we're going to ask them about other groups they're part of. For instance, this here is a man who's born in 1970, lives in Copenhagen, has a master or PhD, and works in finance and insurance. And again, the respondent will tell us what is the median income that he thinks happened in those groups. And the same for the P95, we'll ask them what is the top income here, top 5th percentile for all these groups you're part of. And then finally, where do you rank yourself in each of these groups? So this man born in 1970 is asked to rank himself, for instance, in his cohort, and he puts himself at P70. We'll see if that's true or not. So what do we find when we ask people to rank themselves like that in various groups? Well, here's the core pattern that we have. So on this graph, you can see people's actual position on the horizontal axis. And let's start with the cohort, which is a sort of natural benchmark group. And on the vertical axis, you can see their perceived position by bin of actual position. So you see this very, very clear sort of almost mean reversion pattern where people who are ranked lower will tend to overestimate their position, and those that are ranked higher will tend to underestimate it. And this sort of pattern will be visible for all reference groups. So let me show it right away. Now there's, your perceived position against your actual position for all these reference groups in your cohort, in your gender group, in your municipality, in your education sector, in education or sector group. In all these groups, although the magnitudes differ, there is this pattern, and we're going to call it center bias. So it's actually something very different from mean reversion, because we'll be able to show exactly where it comes from. Because we elicit people's views of the income distribution, we can see that the reason this center bias happens is because your own income very much shapes your perceptions of others' incomes in a systematic way. So people who are ranked lower, who have lower income, tend to think everyone else is poor too. In their mind, the median is shifted to the left and the P95 is also shifted to the left. So they become closer to the center because they think everyone else is poor too. That will lead them to overestimate their position. And vice versa at the top, we will see that people who are rich themselves will tend to think everyone else is richer too. So they will naturally underestimate their position. So it is not mean reversion, which could be mechanical because you're asking about positions. In fact, the pattern here shows that it's not at the extremes that people are most wrong. So it's really driven by your perceptions of others' incomes. It's also not this idea of we all think we're middle class, because this holds for all reference groups. So for instance, if you ask someone who hasn't completed high school, rank yourself, their education group is all relatively low income people. So the middle of that distribution is not a middle class perception. It is a much lower income group. So it is a very specific and systematic bias that happens here. You can also see that it is larger specifically for your education and sector group, and we'll come back to that. It's in those groups that you really overestimate your position if you're lower ranked. You do not realize how highly paid others in your sector or with your education level are. Another thing, mainly for fun, is that we also ask people about small reference groups, like your direct neighbors, your coworkers at your workplace, people you went to school with when you were a teenager. So we can look at the perceptions in those groups. You see that for coworkers, neighbors, schoolmates, we also have this center bias pattern, and it varies in magnitudes across these groups. But we always have that same over and underestimation systematically. Now, if you view these small groups as small scale equivalent of the large groups, the patterns are actually very consistent. If you view your coworkers in your workplace as the small scale equivalent of everyone in your sector, you see that you're much more wrong about your position among your coworkers. And if you view neighbors as the small scale equivalent of everyone in your city, you're much more accurate ranking yourselves among your neighbors or among people in your city, so geographically, than among coworkers in your workplace or coworkers in your sector. So clearly info does not flow very well in the labor market. In particular, people who are actually relatively low ranked very starkly overestimate their position among coworkers and others in their sector. In fact, you're better at ranking yourself among former schoolmates that you used to go to school with when you were 15 than among today's coworkers. How do these mobility perceptions matter for policy views? So they're obviously interesting per se, but is there something more about policy views here? And there is. Let me organize the results around three key findings. So the first is that we almost all agree that lack of mobility is a problem, but our preferred solutions really differ. So if we think back of the first project on intergenerational mobility perceptions across countries, what we see very starkly is that most people are quite worried about lack of social mobility. So they think if children's outcomes are tightly linked to their parents, that's a bad thing. But the preferred solution varies very starkly across partisan lines. So on the left, someone who's more left, and that's not just true for the US, that's true across all the countries in the sample, people who are on the left and who are more pessimistic about mobility will want more government action. They will want more redistribution, more social insurance, and especially more equality of opportunity type policies like education or health policies. For respondents who are on the right, the solution will actually be less government. Their preferred solution to more mobility is let the economy be free, let businesses run, and do not have government intervention, which of course can be mapped to very different attitudes about government to start with. The second big result in all these studies is that the perceived causes of lack of mobility matter. It doesn't just matter that you think there's low or high mobility, it matters why you think there is, and we really disagree on that. So let me build this around the paper on racial gaps, because it's very striking there. So across partisan groups and racial groups, people definitely perceive the conditions and the opportunities of white and Black Americans differently. We saw that on the charts. But by far the biggest disagreement is actually in how people explain these gaps to themselves and what the perceived causes are, and consequently what they think should be done about them. So we can show very clearly that people's support for either general redistribution or race-targeted policies doesn't actually depend on the magnitudes of gaps they perceive. It really just depends on why they think those gaps exist. And the perceptions here are very strongly divided by partisan lines. So if we look at Black and white Democratic respondents together, these are respondents who will generally tend to think that, you know, today's racial gaps are really due to past enslavement, historical factors, discrimination, racism, basically systemic factors, not individual actions. On the right, it will be very much the opposite, where people will attribute a lot to individual action rather than systemic causes. And consequently, people on the left will tend to support income-targeted and general redistribution policies, and people on the right will not. What was very striking to us is that these racial and partisan gaps are actually very prevalent among teenagers already. So the views of teenagers are very much aligned with their parents' partisanship, and in a way that's very, very polarized already. We also do an experiment in this project where we show people two different types of information. So the first is to show information on existing racial gaps and how they haven't diminished over time. For instance, on the earnings gap between Black and white people, or on the mobility gap. And this has really no effect because it changes people's perceptions of these gaps, but it has no effect on policy view. Because telling people how unequal things are, as we just said, doesn't really change their policy views. You have to try to change their views on why things are unequal. And if you actually show a video or an explanation of more of the systemic causes of today's racial gaps, that actually has a much, much bigger impact on people's policy views. So really, showing the how is not sufficient. You have to dig into why and explain to people why things are like that. So in a sense, you know, although there's clearly very large racial gaps and many people are at least to some extent aware of them, the narrative they have about why these gaps exist is very different, and that really leads to very different views on policies. The third big result here is that how you rank yourself relative to others is really important for how fair you think things are and your policy views. So this is something we can see in this Danish project again, where this time if I show you your perceived position in every group, in every big reference group, and your perceived unfairness of income differences within that group. How fair do you think is it to have income differences within gender group, within education group, within sector group? You see that the higher ranked someone is, the more they will think inequality is fair, or the less unfair they will think inequality within those groups is. And you can also see that the largest perceived unfairness is actually for education and sector groups. So people tend to think those are the most unfair inequalities. So let me walk you through the results a bit systematically here. So your rank will be related very strongly to your perceived unfairness. The higher ranked you are, the more fair you think inequality is. It will also be related to a whole range of other things. For instance, the perceived role of effort versus luck. If you're ranked higher, you'll think it's rather effort than luck. You are more likely to vote right of center. You're more likely to support less redistribution. And of course, this is a correlation, but we also try to show this experimentally by actually telling people where they rank and shifting their perceived position, and that confirms these correlations. And we also look a bit quasi-experimentally at life events that happen, for instance, unemployment shocks that shift you down in the positions, or promotions at work that shift you up, and that this shapes your views on inequalities. And as I already alluded to, there's some inequalities that people consider to be more unfair than others. In particular, inequalities between coworkers in a firm or sector, and people with the same education are both perceived to be most unfair and also are much bigger than people think they are. So in a sense, we're much more willing to tolerate inequality conditional on things that we think are not key determinants of income, like municipality, gender, etc., and less willing to tolerate inequalities conditional on things we think should be determinants of income, like sector and education. And the final part is about your own experiences of mobility, you and your ancestors, actually your family history, and this very important notion of zero-sum thinking. Let me introduce that because it's a little bit unusual. So is mobility zero-sum? Obviously, the answer will actually matter. So throughout much of human history, the world was potentially zero-sum in the sense that there was no growth. And so if you do better, it has to come at the expense of someone else. Now, in recent decades, maybe centuries, there is much more growth. So it's a valid question to ask how much of our success today actually comes at the expense of others. And this has implications for policy. If you look at these headlines here from Time Magazine and Forbes, you know, there's this question, does someone's success, especially, for instance, of the wealthy, come at the expense of other people? And it will matter for policy because in a zero-sum world, there's much more role for governments to tax and to sort of try to reduce what is a zero-sum game that happens between different groups. So what we do in this paper, which is joined with Nathan Nunn, Sahil Chinoy, one of our students, and Sandra Sequeira, is to do a pretty long-running survey. It's been going on for 2 years and will keep going, where we ask people about, you know, their background, but very importantly about their whole ancestry. So we go back 3 generations where we ask where people's parents lived, what their occupation was, what their education level was, same for their grandparents. So we have really granular and a pretty big sample data to follow people's history of their whole families in terms of economic and location factors, etc. And then we ask people about their policy views on a range of issues, and importantly, their zero-sum mindset. So let me give you four key questions on how we measure zero-sum thinking. So we try to see, how do people think about different interactions between different groups, and to what extent do they think these are zero-sum interactions? If one group gains, the other loses. So we asked them about whether they think interactions between ethnic groups are zero-sum, between immigrants and non-immigrants, between different countries in the arena of international trade, and between rich and poor or different income groups. And based on that, we can construct, for instance, a zero-sum index, like a principal component index. And it turns out that it's extremely strongly related to a range of policy views. So on this figure, I show you the correlation between this zero-sum index and these outcomes, which are policy views on the left side in rows. So the bold policies are basically indices that summarize policies on a topic. And the first one is general redistribution policies. I put all the components here individually because they're very much a focus of the paper. But then we also have a race attitude index. To what extent, you know, are you racist or not? To what extent do you think it's discrimination? All these things we already discussed. An anti-immigration index, and then a gender attitudes index in the direction of being more, you know, more aware of discrimination, more supportive of affirmative action, etc. So there's a strong correlation. The different dots are basically adding different controls. So beyond baseline controls like age or gender, adding things like party fixed effect, income or education, state fixed effect, but it doesn't change the relation much. And overall, we see that the more zero-sum you are, the more you want redistribution, for instance. The more zero-sum you are, the more anti-immigrant you are as well. The more zero-sum you are, the more you actually think there's a conflict between men and women in the workforce. So the more you're going to support, gender, affirmative action policies. So it's a very strong predictor of your policy views. And in fact, you may wonder, is this just capturing something else? And you can't see it on this graph, but it turns out it's a very different and fundamental mindset from other things. So for instance, if you try to control for people's mobility perceptions or to the extent to which they believe effort versus luck matters, zero-sum is a distinct notion. So it doesn't just matter, for instance, to people that someone is doing well and had lots of opportunities. It also matters to them does the success of that person come at the expense of others or not? So it's a sort of new, but also very important mindset in addition to these other things we talked about, like role of effort, perceptions of mobility. So, in a nutshell, yes, maybe Jeff Bezos worked very hard and it wasn't just all luck to do Amazon, but does his success come at the expense of others, or is he contributing to others, is a very relevant question. And then another thing you may wonder just quickly is this a systematically partisan mindset? And it turns out no. If you plot the zero-sum attitudes, for the different, say, Democratic and Republican respondents, there is a little bit of a sense in which Democratic respondents are slightly more zero-sum, especially on income issues, for instance. They perceive more zero-sum between different income groups, but it's not a very systematic thing. It is there within all types of respondents to different levels. And let's map this back to your experiences of mobility, now that we introduced this important notion that's really relevant for policy. So there's a few determinants of zero-sum thinking that we focus on in the paper, which are very emblematic of the US experience. The first is economic mobility experiences, the second is immigration experiences, and the third is experiences related to race and enslavement. And these, of course, the latter two have direct effects, but also very much shaping lack of opportunity and lack of mobility for different groups. And we think of experiences as having both direct effects, like whether you or your ancestors have experienced them, that's what's called vertical transmission, or whether you have exposure through your environment, which is called horizontal if it happens contemporaneously, or oblique if it's about your environment in the past. And so a few things. One is, what if you have experienced economic mobility through generations? So on these figures, we show your zero-sumness, how zero-sum you are. So the higher the index, the more zero-sum you are, and relative to mobility experiences. So the first graph is relative to your own lifetime. So are you doing better today than you were doing when you were growing up? The middle is relative to your father. Are you doing better? Were you doing better as a child than your father was doing as a child? And then relative to your grandfather. So obviously we take father and grandfather given the economics earnings power of women back in time. And so the higher the mobility index, the better you are doing. So you see that people who have experienced more mobility are significantly less zero-sum. And then once you are to the left of zero, it means you think you're regressing, you're doing worse than yourself in the past or your father or your grandfather. Once you're there, it doesn't really matter how much worse you think you're doing. It's kind of constant, and it's significantly more zero-sum than someone who's doing better. And we can also, related to this issue of mobility, look at how zero-sum thinking varies across cohorts, across generations. So this is showing the zero-sum mindset according to respondent age on the horizontal axis. So overall, you can see that young respondents are much more zero-sum than older respondents, with some interesting fluctuations. And if you map this to the economic environment these people grow up in, for instance, if you look at what was economic growth when these cohorts were growing up, it lines up almost perfectly with the zero-sum attitude. So people who grow up in worse economic environments, and obviously this is growth, but you can also potentially map this to mobility experiences that have potentially declined. The US maybe used to be less zero-sum in terms of mobility than today. You can see this clean generational pattern. And I want to just tell you that this is not just about the US. If you look at World Value Survey data, they actually luckily have a question that is relatively about zero-sum, which is people can only get rich at the expense of others. And you can see that people who grew up in environments where growth was low, so in their first 20 years of life, if GDP growth was low, across, I think it's 20 or 30 countries here, they have significantly more zero-sum attitudes. And then in the interest of time, I'm just going to quickly fly over the other two big phenomena that are related to zero-sum. One is immigration, which is something where big immigration waves were actually correlated with mobility, especially historically. Immigrants witnessed big improvements in life quality relative to their children, and this didn't come at the expense of others, it's been shown. And what we can see is that if you are an immigrant yourself, first generation, or second or third, relative to non-immigrants, you are significantly less zero-sum. So that's the vertical if you want, transmission of immigrant experiences. But we can also see something similar if you live in places with more immigrants, especially these historical waves of immigration. Being exposed to those immigrants, for instance, if your grandfather lived in those counties which received the historical immigration waves, you today are less zero-sum. And I'll end with this, this third very important thing, which is the link between coercion and zero-sum thinking. So of course, the most extreme form was enslavement in the US, but there's other forms of basically enslavement that were happening afterwards. So the first thing to see is that by race, this is very clear. African-American and Black respondents have much higher perceptions of zero-sum than white respondents or other racial groups. And if we look at other forms of enslavement, zooming in only on non-Black individuals, so these will be things like the Holocaust, experiences through ancestry of the Holocaust, or other forms of abuse and coercion, you're significantly more zero-sum if there was such a history in your family. And if you live in places which had a higher share of enslaved back in the 1860s, whether it's you, your parents, or your grandparents, there's a much more higher likelihood that you think in zero-sum terms today. So I know this was a little bit quick, but so just to wrap this up, going back to the beginning, spatial inequality has been very persistent in the US. Perceptions of mobility in the US are generally over-optimistic, especially regarding the mobility of Black children. There's systematic center bias, whereby we think we are closer to the center because our own income shape our perceptions of how rich or poor others are. And these perceptions of mobility and ranking are really important for policy views. So the more we believe in equality of opportunity, the more we're willing to tolerate inequality of outcomes, in a nutshell. But there's this other very important thing, which is, did your success come at the expense of others, which is this notion of a zero-sum mindset that is strongly related to your experiences or your exposure, either yourself or through your families. So thank you very much.